is Paul de Klerk. I work for Friends of the Earth Europe, and we're part of Friends of the Earth coalition with 80 member groups worldwide, a lot of them working on issues of extractive industry and deforestation. I have one specific question and two more general points. But I want to start with saying that we're also very happy with the proposal from the Commission. My specific question is to the issue of, you said that the proposal covers non-listed companies, and as Simon already pointed out, this also covers companies which are not maybe headquartered in Europe, but which might have a certain presence in Europe. I'm asking this because I'm also working on corporate accountability issues, and also the somehow similar issue of mandatory non-financial reporting will probably come with the same issue. So I would ask the Commission, Claire, to specify a little bit more which non-listed companies which are not European would be covered by this, because I think it would be good to take that as wide as possible to avoid level playing field issues. Yeah. And the second issue that I want to bring up is I want to put the discussion on mandatory disclosure of revenue payments in a broader perspective, because I don't want to downplay the importance of it, but I think it is also necessary to understand that a poor person in Equatorial Guinea is not suddenly going to be lifted from the miserable situation because companies are reporting how much they pay the government. A dictatorial government is not going to change because of that. So I would also like to ask the Commission and maybe also the Parliament to look into other steps to make sure that specifically in extractive industry sector, which has a lot of negative impacts in developing countries, other steps that are necessary to achieve that people are actually leaving their miserable situation. And then you can think of global environmental standards, global human rights standards, giving people who are suffering from problems created by these industries, giving them access to justice in European courts, for instance. So, and one other question, I think the issue...
Well, that would be three, which is more, 3 times as many as anyone else has had. No, we've had two questions. We're getting a bit short of time, so I mean, the second one was a question that requires a very big answer. So I'd like to ask the speakers to come back on the first one, and to what extent they can on the second. Maybe Claire, as it was addressed to you primarily.
Yeah, sure.
Non-listed companies.
Well, in terms of the large non-listed companies, what we've got at the moment is that a large company is defined as one which has a turnover of 40 million euro, total assets of 20 million, and 250 employees. You asked as well, I think, about those companies which are listed on EU markets, but which may not be domiciled here, right? Because there was a concern, I think I can say in this room, for companies about Gazprom and so on, that was... Well, the problem there is we don't have a remit for those large companies which are non-listed. Because at the moment, our directives, the accounting directives, only cover those which are domiciled in the EU. I mean, to be covered by those directives, you have to be set up, have your registered office in the EU. So anybody else, I'm afraid, we can't catch. I mean, then we get extraterritorial, which the US is very good at, but which we've tried to avoid up until now. I mean, you talked about the non-financial, the CSR reporting. I mean, again, then I think the question is going to be very much where we set the threshold. But, I mean, that's a debate for another day, I think, because there are different considerations around it.
Just a quick couple of comments. I completely agree with the sentiment of widening the discussion out to have other, I like to think of them as disincentives, perhaps. Just one example. In the US, even President Bush did this. He created something called Presidential Proclamation 7750, if I've got the number right. I might be misquoting that, which essentially was an kleptocracy provision, which would allow for a visa ban for those people involved in corruption or deemed to be involved in corruption. That was modified through a small amendment on the Senate side of the Congress to focus on those politically exposed people, dictators, their sons, their relatives, and so on, for whom there is credible evidence that they have benefited from looting, essentially, the assets of their country through natural resource extraction and so on. What that in turn has created, a very small department so far, it's not well resourced yet, but getting better, is a capacity to deny visa for politically exposed people. And why that's important is, if you live in Equatorial Guinea and you nick tens of millions of dollars, you want to go shopping. You want to go to the Champs-Élysées, you want to go to Fifth Avenue, you want to go to all these other nice places. If you can't go there, as is now the case for Teodorin Obiang, who had his house seized recently, it becomes much more difficult. So in the context of Europe, I would definitely support Europe thinking about other additional mechanisms. And so I say that in the context that this mechanism we're talking about today I see as one part of a wider set of mechanisms we need to bring in to address this wider resource curse problem.
Reinhard.
Well, the second question you asked is really opening a very wide discussion.
Yeah.
It's about the context between trade and development cooperation. And in the discussions that we had in the Parliament, we found a majority, and to some degree I was even surprised how strong the support was for that view, supporting the vision that the basic economic dynamic in that relationship had to be changed from reducing resource-rich countries to a subservient role as resource providers for our value chains, changing that into giving them a cooperative opportunity to develop their own value chains. And I think that this change of the economic dynamic is the decisive issue. Question is, European countries haven't done that for a long time, as much as you might have wanted them to. Why would there be hope now that that would change, that might change? My basic argument would be China. The competition over access to resources globally is getting so intense, and Europeans are so much threatened of maybe sitting at the shorter side of the lever, that I think it will increasingly become an imperative for our cooperation strategies to see to it that we offer our partners in these fields, the resource-rich countries, an economic opportunity that would allow us to stay involved. Because we did a hearing as a Green Group in the Parliament in the context of these deliberations, and someone from the African Union was one of the presenters and questioned about the comparison between what China's doing to some of these countries presently and their European experience. He said, well, in his mind, I don't know how representative that is, but he said that publicly. In this comparison, we're profiting more from China than we have been profiting from most of the European countries. And if that is the attitude, Europe has to think again about how to find a new basis for cooperation. And I think that could be exactly this new perspective. Member states are offering resource-rich countries what they call raw materials partnerships. I've heard people from these countries saying, what do you mean raw materials partnership? If it's supposed to be a partnership, it should be about your advantage and our advantage. You're only mentioning what you want from us. You're not mentioning what you're going to give to us. So I think this new this new way of thinking about a different attitude towards development cooperation is what would be needed to really make progress with regard to the broader picture that you mentioned.
Thanks. Vicky, did you want to come
make
any comments on that?
I mean, I sort of half agree with what Reinhard was saying, but it sounds to me that if this is going to be driven by governments, we're going to require a whole bunch of state-owned mining companies that we don't currently have in Europe. The way we see it from a business perspective, and particularly within the mining sector, the ICMM has done a lot of work on what they call the Mining Partnerships for Development Programme, is that we, as a mining company, in order to get access to the resources of a country, need to make an offer which is attractive, and that offer often involves commitments around local content, local employment, around working with local industries. And I'm not necessarily talking about, if we go into to mine iron ore, we say we're going to build a steel mill, but thinking with the local community and the national government, what is the revenue from that iron ore? How can it best be used to develop other spin-off economies so that when the iron ore is mined out, the company doesn't leave nothing left over? So we certainly see that as part of the offer that we as a company need to make. We need to engage in that dialogue and deliver on issues like commitments on procurement. Going back to the Friends of the Earth speaker, you didn't mention this question of effective revenue management, because I think that is actually what is going to make the difference between the Angolan that you mentioned and the one that you showed the picture of. It's not whether or not there are high environmental standards around the De Beers mine. It's where the income from the De Beers operation going into the Angolan government is spent, and that's where I think there's a really important role for governments, for the European Commission, to push more on effective revenue management, so that it is going into the health and education sectors in countries rather than going off into villas and cars.
Okay, good. Vicky, thank you very much. We've slightly run over time, but I'd like to invite Andrew Vickers from Shell to make some concluding remarks. Thanks, everyone. Microphone.
Thanks, and I'm Andrew Vickers is my name, and I'm responsible for stakeholder and NGO relations in Shell. First of all, just a couple of thank yous. First of all, Simon, thanks for excellent facilitation. Before I came, I was very annoyed with Simon from Global Witness, because it was completely lacking transparency. The fact that he told me that he hadn't told me that he'd taken up a journalistic career. So I was quite pleased when I got here to see two people rather than just one person. I'd also like to thank Common Visions, which in my oil and gas parlance is a joint venture, and that joint venture actually enables discussions like this. I'd like to thank them for putting it on, especially for putting together such a diverse panel. Almost this time last week, I was at the memorial service of a gentleman called Sir Geoffrey Chandler. Sir Geoffrey was a Shell director for a period of time, and then went on to found Amnesty International Business Section. And it was fascinating eulogies read out. And one thing about this gentleman was that he was a value-driven individual. And I agree with, I forget which of the panellists spoke about, this is a value matter. And Sir Geoffrey put in place what we call the Shell General Business Principles in 1976. And many people, especially those in new business development, felt that it would be a hindrance to have some principles that you could hold up in front of partners to say, we don't give brown envelopes. And there was a lot of opposition, but it was a leap of faith, and that leap of faith was the right leap of faith. And I think in this space, there's a big piece to do with values. However, I would like to just comment on some of the points made. First of all, I was in a briefing with Peter Voser, who's our chief executive. I can't remember whether it was just before Dodd-Frank or the Lugar Amendment. And in his amicable style, he listened to the finance guy and the legal guy, and he didn't say a word. And I was fascinated to think, what are you thinking, Peter? And he stood up and he said, look, I've got nothing to hide. It's just I don't want it to be commercial disadvantage in the process. And I think that's the key thing, is that Shell today produces around 2% of global oil and gas. And if you speak to our board members, I think we're not so worried about BPs who are sitting here or the Exxons. But there are a number of, and I think Reinhard was talking about the competition, and it is from the Chinese and the Saudis and what have you. And so we do have issues just to make sure that we're not actually giving information away that could competitively disadvantage us. This is a real issue. I'd like to think that we don't hide behind the API. I think Shell does have a track record of standing up and speaking for itself. I was going to say that I think tonight was a timely event, but I think actually I was wrong. I think we should have been doing this 2 or 3 years ago, and I think if I look in the mirror, I think industry didn't do itself a service, and I think we refrained from discussions like this before Dodd-Frank, and what we're now seeing is actually the discussion and the debate which should have happened beforehand. So I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror on that. Actually, I do agree, if we want to be friends of the earth, actually, I think the conversation tonight has focused on revenue transparency, but there's a lot more to transparency than purely revenue. And I was intrigued and fascinated with your comments about fence lines and the importance of actually having stakeholders on board. I think the same applies to whether it's impact assessments or other information about operations. I think often when it comes to stakeholders on the ground, and I think whilst we're talking about global accounting, like mining, we share the sort of local community angle, which I think was a little bit missing tonight, but so be it. Actually, I also agree that the mining sector are ahead of oil and gas. I think there are various reasons for that. Mining companies tend to have a slightly less geographic portfolio and more focus on certain countries, but I would also agree with that. So just in conclusion, when I was a little boy, people used to say you can avoid death and taxes. After Enron, I think our chief executive said you can add compliance onto that. I think it's now death, compliance and transparency are things that one cannot avoid in life. So with that, I would like to invite you to the drinks which are on the other side of the forum here. I am joined by 2 colleagues from Shell. Maybe they can put their hands up. It's Hans van der Loo and Alex Trott over here. If you feel I have ducked questions that I should have answered, then I would encourage you to come up to one of us and we'll try our best. So thanks very much, Simon.
Thank you. Thanks.